welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Today we're going to be looking at a guy that I think probably most of our listeners are not very familiar with him by name, but you're certainly familiar with some of his work, and that is William Cowper. And Chris, I think when I read the story of William Cowper and I look at his life, the way I phrase it is William Cowper was a man of faith, but he was also a man of fear.
Wow. You're just coming right off the gate, just hard with that. I love that.
It's deep.
And you know what? I mean, this guy right here had it all, almost lost it all. And yet he is one of those individuals who a lot is credited to his name. And yet very few people know anything about him. I thought something that was interesting is, the catchphrase, that's not the right thing, but the phrase, variety is the spice of life. That actually came from William Cowper. That was part of his writings and poetry and prose and all of that. And when it comes to William Cowper, he had a lot of variety. And it kept him engaged and very heavily involved in everything from business to religion and even to abolitionism. So I really look forward to kind of delving into his life and understanding about fate, but also understanding fear and kind of how that ties into our lives as well.
Yeah, and just to sort of tee this off a little bit, one of his more popular hymns, which he was a hymn writer, and we'll get to this later, but I want to sort of put this up front, maybe give our listeners a little bit of clue of who this guy was. Quote, "When this poor lisping, stammering tongue lies silent in the grave, then in a nobler, sweeter song, I'll sing thy power to save," end quote. There is a fountain filled with blood. And if you've been in a church for any length of time, or maybe you grew up in church, that's a song you've heard. That's a song you've sang maybe. And that was a William Cowper song. And, we're going to talk about him and Chris, his ups, like you mentioned there, but also his very, very dark downs.
Yeah, and William Cowper, born over there in England, and we've kind of mentioned a lot lately of some individuals that we've talked to being born of preachers, and here's another one was born to a pastor. And what I find interesting is he loses his mom at a very early age, but William Cowper, he did the variety is the spice of life thing, because Cowper's background was that of a gentleman. His great uncle was Lord Chancellor of England, which is a huge role in all of England. But yet William Cowper, even though he had the lineage from the money man of England, he basically lived his life from a lack of money and was dependent. I mean, he was kind of like panhandling all of the time, trying to find money just to survive. And he would go from here to there to make it. And yet he knew all of the classics. He was a very brilliant young man, but it just goes to show you that smarts isn't what necessarily will bring in the money or bring in the happiness of life.
Yeah, he was the first surviving child of Reverend John Cowper and Anne Cowper. He was the first surviving child of this couple. His mom, Anne, however, died when he was very young. I think he was, under 10 years old when his mom passed away. He does go to school. He goes to Westminster School, where he is exposed to some of the greatest writings, whether you're talking about Pilgrim's Progress or whatever. He learns Latin. Like you said, he's a very smart young man. But you know what? Even at a young age, things are rough for him. Like I said a second ago, his mom died when he was very young, and that's going to have a deep impact on his entire life. Because many years later, he's going to write a poem on the receipt of my mother's picture, which of course talks about his mom. And then also while he's at the school, he is going to face some very severe bullying. We think of bullying as being a modern problem, but bullying was a problem even in Cooper's day. He talked about that the people, his bulliers, the people who bullied him, he knew them by their shoe buckles better than anything else. So he knew what their feet looked like more than what they looked like. So, this is a young man who, he's, like you said, he's got a lot going for him, but he's, even at a very young age, he loses his mom. He's facing bullying while he's at school.
Yeah. And then a little bit later on, William experiences that first love, and he finds himself really infatuated, if you will, to this girl whose name was Theodora, and he wanted to marry Theodora. A couple of things were going on with that. First of all, Theodora was his cousin. But the other thing is that his uncle, who was very well established in, the circles of law and other things of that nature, I think he was actually the clerk to the House of Parliament. So, I mean, this is a big time guy. And he did not allow his nephew William to marry Theodore. And basically, one of the reasons he said you can't is because if you two get together, basically it's going to be a depressing marriage. And so early on, what happens is Theodore and William never marry. And he will really struggle with this, and it will actually start sending him into depression. And Ray, we talk a lot about the severity of mental illness in today's society. And, I think coming out of COVID, we've really even dug deeper into what brings about mental illness, and especially during the winter months when we have this time of winter, which it brings on the blues, as people will say. Depression is a serious thing. And if it's not treated, it can lead to, even greater issues. And I think with William Cooper here at an early age, this losing his mother, being rejected, being bullied, basically struggling just to make ends meet, he falls into a very, very dark period in his life. And Ray, he seems to be spiraling out of control and not really knowing if there is any hope, that fate and fear kind of thing that he starts wrestling with.
Yeah, and it's not long after he is turned away by his uncle after he wants to marry Theodora. He's offered a very good position in the House of Lords there in England. He's offered a clerkship of journals, and in order to get this position, he has to go through an interview, I guess is what we would call it today. They called it like an examination. And this drives him almost to the point of, insanity. He goes into a very deep depression in 1763, just thinking about the idea of having to go before this board and be interviewed. He experiences this deep depression and anxiety and insanity, and he actually attempts suicide during this time on at least 2 or 3 different occasions. And it takes him to Nathaniel Cotton's Insanarium, which I guess is like a hospital, a mental hospital, where he stays there for some time, at least until 1764. So again, you're seeing someone who, he's looking to move into this very important position, but at the same time, he can't pull himself out of this emotional hole that he finds himself going down.
And what's interesting is, once again, history you didn't know but should. But this individual who was running the sanatorium or the hospital, Dr. Cotton, is one of the first people in England who actually treats mental problems as an illness. He calls it what it is. He sees it as, a sickness that needs to be treated. And, for a lot of times people had just kind of brushed it off and really not really paid attention to it. But Dr. Cotton, sees something. And William is one of his first, quote, patients, if you will. And one of the things that Dr. Cotton prescribes as a treatment to the illness is prayer. That prayer is a key ingredient, developing a relationship with God that will help you to battle or manage, the mental illness that he was being affected by. Well, that is kind of another segue into William Cowper's life, because as he begins to experiment with prayer and he begins to recover from that deep, dark depression that he finds himself in, that it leads to the beginning of his conversion to Christianity, which you mentioned the song earlier, that we sing in church. There's a fountain filled with blood. And so we start to see how even in the darkest of days, he found a ray of hope and he clung on to that. And it actually sends him into a different area, which will help him because he starts to meet another, I guess you could say, family who starts to take him in and basically will treat him as another son that they have.
Yeah, and it's a clergyman by the name of Morley Unwin. And Morley Unwin is married to a lady called Mary, and he basically moves in with them for all intents and purposes. He's living with them, and they're treating him as part of the family. And also Morley is ministering to him, is helping him. It's while he's there that he meets a new person in his life, John Newton. And for our listeners who may not know who John Newton was, and maybe a different podcast here, but John Newton was the author of the famous hymn, Amazing Grace. And Newton, of course, had been very heavily involved in the slave trade, and he was converted as well to Christianity. And after that, he eventually gave up the slave trade and repented of his involvement in that trade. And it's while Cowper is at Unwin's home that he meets John Newton. And John Newton is going to have a very big impact on Cowper's life, and they're going to become very, very close friends. Now, of course, another aspect of what's going to happen here after he gets into the Unwin household is Morley Hooper is going to pass away. He's going to die, and then Cowper is going to get somewhat involved, I guess, with Mary up Unwin, and that's going to raise some eyebrows because they're going to spend an awful lot of time together, living together, or at least living under the same roof, and that's going to raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, and they're forced to move, and you've got people talking, you've got a lot of things that are going on, and it actually causes William to suffer another major mental breakdown. And we just talked about how he had felt moved by God, that God had converted him, had changed him, had healed him, but now in this moment he feels forsaken by God, and he stops attending church. He really cuts off his contact with Newton, although they still are kind of writing some hymns together and things of that nature. But it's kind of this moment where he's really struggling with his identity and trying to figure out, because all of these things keep happening. And Ray, it's we find ourselves sometimes in this thing that's called the circle of life, where good and then bad, and then good and then bad, and it's just this revolving thing. And we're kind of like, when can it just be good? When can it? And for Cooper, Cooper, I think he's experiencing that. He's trying to find out, how can it just be good? And that's when he gets drawn into or introduced into writing. And I guess I would say that writing is seen as therapy for him, that it's a way for him to, I guess, sort of like people today who like to journal, who like to express their feelings and their thoughts by putting, it on paper, getting it out. But Ray, he begins to move into the circle of good life when he begins writing, and will experience probably the most productive period of his career.
Yeah, and it was John Newton that actually pulled him into writing hymns. Now, of course, he's going to be a prolific author of poetry. And I believe at that particular time, he was one of the most prolific poetry writers of the day. But John Newton himself pulls him into writing hymns. And it's during this time you see him writing hymns like Light Shining Out of the Darkness, and There Is a Fountain Filled with Blood, and other hymns that are part of this hymnal that Newton is putting together. So, yeah, he becomes very prolific as a poet, as a hymnist during this time.
And I found it interesting that he begins writing these poems, if you will, and things are going pretty good. When he's with Newton, things are having a lot of success. And the first book that he writes is not very good. It doesn't get. I guess it wouldn't make the New York Times bestsellers list. I think it was just fell flat. But he keeps trying. He keeps working. And he writes this new one that's called, or this new poem, if you will. It was called The Task. And The Task, I thought, was a pretty interesting piece of poetry that he wrote, because he was complaining of writer's block, as the story goes. He couldn't come up with anything to write. He was getting discouraged, and he really didn't know what to do. But he had met Lady Austen, who is very familiar in literary circles, and especially over in England. And he goes there and says, "Listen, I am struggling. I don't know what to write." And she said, "If you want to be successful, if you want to get back on track, you need to write about your sofa." And so that's what he wrote about. He starts writing about his sofa, which leads to him writing the poem, The Task, which compares city life with the pleasures of the countryside, and, kind of what's good, what's bad, the vices and then the joys. And he gets his mojo back. He gets that pen put to paper, and he begins the reinventing, if you will, of his literary career.
Yeah, because he struggled there for a while. And before this, and we talk about reinventing himself, because he meets Lady Austen and does The Task in the 1780s. But it was in 1773, going back a little bit, and you hinted at this, that he dives headlong into darkness, head first into darkness. He had a dream on January 1, 1773, in which he heard God speak to him in Latin. And I do not know Latin, so I'm not going to try to say what was said in the dream, but it would be translated as, "It's all over with thee, thou hast perished." And he writes a poem about this, I think later on, obviously, after, like you said, he sort of got back into things, called, and the name of the poem, there's two different names. One is Hatred and Vengeance, My Eternal Portion. And the other is Lines Written During a Fit of Insanity. And just to give you, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but we'll just do the two first verses. Hatred and vengeance, my eternal portion, scarce can endure delay of execution. Wait with impatient readiness to seize my soul in a moment. Damned below Judas, more abhorrent than he was, who for a few pence sold his holy master, twice betrayed Jesus me, the last delinquent deems the profanest. So he's, he views himself, he says here, damned below Judas. And so this cloud comes over him. And even though he's going to get his mojo back, so to speak, he's going to sort of get back into writing, and with his relationship with Mary Unwin and Lady Austen, he's still going to have this cloud that's constantly over him, threatening to overcome him at any moment.
Yeah. And, ultimately, that is where that Castaway, which is probably one of his finest poems, is written, and basically describes his mental traumas. And ultimately, in 1800, he passes away, and it's devastating because it just shows you the struggles that he faced and the trials that he experienced. But also, he did leave a legacy to be remembered.
Yeah, and before he died, he does die in 1800. Mary Unwin died in 1796, and that was, I guess you could say, the final nail, because that is when that cloud that I spoke of a minute ago isn't just hanging over him; it just starts pouring rain, and it never lets up.
Yeah.
But one of the things about not Hooper, excuse me, one of the things about Cooper is that he was very fortunate in a lot of ways. One of the ways was he had very good friends around him. You talk about Mary Unwin, you could talk about some of these other people, but John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, talks about bringing him in and trying to help him and just ministering to Cooper during those very, very dark times. And it must have been very difficult. In fact, I know it was very difficult for Newton. He wrote at one point about his years of friendship with Cooper. He says, "The first 6 I passed in daily admiring and aiming to imitate him. During the second 6, I walked pensively with him in the valley of the shadow of death." So, but one thing Cooper had going for him was he did have these people around him who were willing to hold him up. I mean, if he didn't have them, I think life would have been even darker for Cooper, if even such thing is possible.
It just speaks a lot about the importance of relationships that matter and having people that will help in times of distress, in times of need. And William Cooper had those. He will be popular with many later novelists, Jane Austen, also Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte, and a lot of others who will actually quote him and use some of his writings as they become literary heroes, heroines as well. So I don't know, Ray, I thought this was a good selection that you chose because it shows the importance of paying attention to all aspects of life and never giving up and recognizing, surround yourself with good people, recognize every day is a day to live out your best and give it your best, and find success in all things, but especially in the little things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Chris, thanks for a great episode. This one on William Cooper. We hope our listeners have found something about William Cooper. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they never heard of him. Maybe they never heard of John Newton. But now they've been able to hopefully put some hymns with some people that maybe they have heard of. If you like this episode, we encourage you to share it. You can find us on Spotify, Amazon Music, Anchor FM, and other places where you get your podcast. Check us out on Facebook and on Twitter. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.